Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining in. We are just getting started. We've got some people joining now, so we'll give it a couple more minutes before we officially start. But we look forward to welcoming you again on this latest version of our Science Saturday series.
I might add that if you have a notebook or something like that, you might want to jot down questions or thoughts that you might have as we go through this thing.
Yes, we will be doing Q&A at the end. So anything that you would love to ask Jon Bachman, please do so. Give it a couple more minutes and then we'll kick this off.
I'm ready.
Well, I think we will go ahead and get started this morning. I am Ann Wilson, Director of Marketing and Communications here at Stratford Hall. I'm filling in for Dr. Kelly Fanto-Dietz, who is hosting another program today. She's our Director of Collections and Visitor Engagement. And we are joined by Jon Bachman, who you are probably well familiar with him. He is our Manager of Education and Outreach and paleontology, archaeology guru here at Stratford Hall.
I don't know about
we are thrilled to have you today for our latest Science Saturday series, Oysters and the Chesapeake Bay. So I will hand it over to Jon Bachman. And as we mentioned at the beginning, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. I'm going to share screen here.
Okay. Boom. There it is.
Yes.
Okay. Getting ready for the dynamic PowerPoint here. So, all right. Should I begin?
Go ahead.
All right. Hey, welcome everybody to, like Ann said, another Science Saturday. It's not really at Stratford Hall. I'm speaking to you from the room that has been dubbed at my house the fossil room, and it's easier to. I'm surrounded by old dead animals. It's just amazing. So anyway, hey, today we're going to be talking about a subject that is very, very important, and that is the oysters, and not just about. We'll talk about their life cycles and things like that, but how important oysters are to the Chesapeake Bay. So I'm going to lay a couple of facts on you quick. Okay, here we go. Oysters have been around for about 145 million years. Okay, I'm not going to go into the whole paleontological record of them, but that's a pretty long time, 145 million years. The Chesapeake Bay, which you can see there on the title slide, is really only about 20,000 years old. Okay, so you got the oysters at 145 mil, and then you have the Chesapeake Bay at about 20,000 years. The Chesapeake Bay is the drowned river, Susquehanna River, that goes up into Pennsylvania. In fact, you can see it kind of on that Lancet map there on the title slide. But all of that blue that we now know, right there, or dark color water. Yeah. And hey, Ann, that's great if you could point to that, just kind of do stuff. The Chesapeake Bay is the drowned river. And it drowned when the last glacial retreat began about 20,000 years ago. And it's not uncommon for watermen to dredge up mastodon bones and teeth and all kinds of stuff that lived at the end of the last glacial period. All right, you guys ready? Here we go. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to read these, and I'm not insulting your intelligence here, but as I read them, think about questions you might have and thoughts you might have. Okay, summer of 1608, Smith, Captain John Smith, makes a couple of voyages from Jamestown to explore the Chesapeake Bay and the rivers that feed it. Smith documented the natural environment. He did have a fairly accurate, for the time, geographic description of the bay, features of the land, the waterways, and he also had some not so good encounters with the native peoples that he met along the way. So Smith is the first documented Englishman that explored the Chesapeake Bay. Next slide. And he writes that the oysters lay as thick as stones. Now, this is kind of hard for us to believe now in our 21st century lifestyle, but oyster reefs, you know what a reef is? Oyster reefs were so huge in the Chesapeake Bay that they posed navigational problems to ships. I'm not sure where this photo was taken, but this gives you an idea. Now, again, they don't live above water. They have to be submerged, right? Periodically, a couple of times a day, so they can feed. But anyway, Smith writes, lay as thick as stones. Next slide, please. For thousands of years, oysters were harvested by the Algonquian-speaking Virginia Native Americans along the shores of the Chesapeake Bay. The oyster proved to be a food source that the indigenous peoples, the native Virginia Indians, could depend on. So for thousands of years, they harvested. Next slide, please. Native American women harvested the oysters and prepared them for eating or preserved them for winter use. Pretty obvious picture. Now this is cool. These are called middens, M-I-D-D-E-N-S. And we have the one in the upper right corner. Anne, could you point to that
right here?
Which one? Oh, no, go over to the next one, where you were. Yeah, that one. That is on the Stratford Hall property, and that's a midden. The other ones were photographs come from other tidewater sites in the coastal plain here in Virginia, but that's our guy right there. And so these were rubbish mounds. And I wanted to show you, and I'm holding up, if you can see that, it's flat on one side. I picked this, and this is an artifact. This was used by the Indians, the native Virginia Indians at Stratford Hall, and who knows how long ago, hundreds, perhaps thousands of years ago. And I picked it up in this midden that Anne indicated. So middens, okay? Right. Got it, okay, sorry. Next slide. Sorry. Okay. During and after European settlement, the colonists harvested and used oysters locally. Okay, so, you're looking for anything that can keep you alive. And if you know much about the early Virginia history, keeping alive was a major task. And the colonists in this area would have relied on the knowledge and the information from the native peoples to survive. And oysters were a major part, again, of a sustainable food source that the early colonists could rely on. But they had to be shown how to get them, how to collect them, where they lived, things like that. And so that's very important. So this is just a couple of shots of and we're going to be talking about what you're seeing there a little later. So colonists harvested and used oysters locally. Next slide. They were inexpensive and they were found all over the place. And Americans in general, and I'm speaking of East Coast cities. Oh, wow. Guess what? And I got to share this with you. A squirrel is trying to get into the fossil room. I guess he wants to, too much. Anyway, so who knows? That was kind of cute. Anyway, so these are some early photographs of people enjoying oysters and not in this area. All along the East Coast, really down into Florida, Americans discovered the oyster. Next. Now, early small-scale harvesting, okay? Harvesting, usually by hand picking, raking, or tonging. That wasn't meeting the demand for oysters through the because people were really falling in love with it. So check out the pictures of and we're going to see more about this later on, of how oysters were traditionally harvested. We'll talk about the new stuff in a little bit. Next slide. And by the middle of the 19th century, a commercial oyster industry had been created and was a major industry in the Chesapeake Bay. I mean, a major industry. Again, I tried to select photographs and pictures that would give you, the viewer, some sense of of how complex this must have been. Hundreds and hundreds of people in the 19th century, just about around the Civil War, began working in the Chesapeake Bay oyster industries. And the boats, check out the boats in that photograph. And that's just a small indication of what it must have been like. Next slide. Now, one of the areas that I found out and I wanted to share with everyone was the fact that African Americans often performed this work. Okay, the oysters that were enjoyed up and down the East Coast were more than likely harvested by African Americans, and after the Civil War, and prior to the Civil War, the enslaved African Americans would have also been instrumental early on in being the sort of pioneers of the industry. More pictures that show how you can see the tonging method there. Next slide. These pictures blow my mind, okay? This is just one of dozens and dozens of huge, immense piles of shells that soon became pretty common to see throughout the Chesapeake Bay region. I mean, how many oysters do you think are there? I mean, that's amazing. And this photo was taken about 1880, 1885. Next slide. Okay, tongers, okay, use these tongs for gathering oysters. They range from 7 to 24 feet long, 24 feet long, 7 feet by 24, or 7 feet to 24. And they look like two garden rakes that closed in on each other. So you opened up the tongs, went down, smushed them together, hold them up, right? Now, that doesn't seem like it would be too bad for, a couple of times. But to do that for 8 to 10 hours a day, perhaps as much as 6 or 7 times a week, would take a a lot of strength just to do that over and over and over again. Next slide. In the 1800s, okay, roughly, fishermen began to use dredges. Now, this is a key element in the health of the bay. Now, why? I'm going to ask a question, then I'm going to answer it. You know, why would they use dredges? Well, dredges drag, you can see the pictures, drag along the ocean floor or the bay floor and collect oysters too deep for tongs, okay? And one of the things that fishermen noticed in the 1800s to about 1900 was that oysters were going deeper, okay? So they had to invent a method of scraping the bottom to grab the oysters. Now, we're going to find out later, but this will be a spoiler alert, okay, that what they were doing was destroying the homes for future oysters. As they drug the oyster, as they drug these drag operations across the bay floor, they would, they inadvertently ripped up the entire substrat or the rocks and the other oysters that oysters need to live, okay? During this time from 1880 to 1910, 160 million pounds of oyster meat were harvested every year. That's amazing, okay? During the Civil War, one of the cheapest foods to feed soldiers in this area, and I know this firsthand because we live on property that was the battlefield. And in just digging up stuff for gardens and stuff, I have come across piles of oyster shells along with Civil War artifacts. And so barrels of oysters would be brought into to the soldiers here along the Rappahannock. I'm speaking to you from outside of Fredericksburg, but oysters were a common food that was fed to the soldiers during the Civil War. About 160 million pounds. Amazing. Next slide, please. By the 1980s, though, overharvesting, which I've explained about the dredging, disease, which we will talk about, and pollution, which I think most of us know now how damaging it is to the environment, reduced the oysters to just 1%. Now that chart on the lower left there, okay, shows the precipitous drop in oyster production. Now, you may not be a big oyster eater, but let me tell you, if you were back in 1900 or 1890 and you were living along the Chesapeake Bay, or if you were in a fancy restaurant up and down the East Coast, you were eating Chesapeake Bay oysters that would be iced down, put in railway cars, and sent north and south and west. Apparently, they delivered as far as Cincinnati. Next slide. Oysters live in a salty or brackish water, brackish meaning it's like a little salty and a little fresh, on all U.S. coasts, clustering on older shells. See, they cluster, they start out on the older shells, rocks, piers, you know, any hard submerged surface. They fuse together as they grow and forming rock-like reefs that provide habitat for lots of other animals and plants. Next slide. Okay, a little bio here, right? Oysters are sessile invertebrates. Sessile invertebrates mean they don't move around, okay? Once they, in their life cycle, there is a free living larval stage. And it skirts around and is looking for a nice place on a rock or another oyster, and that's where it hooches onto, and that's where they grow. And again, when we raked the bottom of the bay because we like to eat them, we tore up their homes. Okay, of course, oysters are bivalves. I want to show you something here real quick, okay? I'm going to hold up a prehistoric oyster that we think is approximately 20,000 years old. Now, I'm holding it next to my head, okay, to give you some sort of sign. Now, on the other side of my head, I'm going to hold up the modern oyster. That should speak pretty much by itself there. They form, they're bivalves, they're exoskeletons or shells, and they fold along in something called a mantle. But check out the little chart there. Mouth, stomach, heart. Can you show them where the heart is, Ann? Right there. I don't know if you can do that with your pointer. Yeah, there it is. Abductor muscle is the muscle that pulls it shut. I'm not sure what tentacles do. They're I know what they do. They strain the water coming into the shell. Gills, okay, a place for excreting waste, the anus. Mantle, intestines, and palps. I am not really sure what the palps are. I should have done this, but very interesting. Okay, so you got a shot of the internal organs of an oyster. Next slide, please. Oysters are filter feeders, meaning that they use their gills to strain phytoplankton out of the water. They also use their gills to absorb oxygen from the water. An adult oyster can filter 50 gallons of water per day. That's one oyster, 50 gallons. Next slide. All right, this is crazy. You ready for this? It is estimated that by the middle of the 19th century, that's the 1800s, think about the Civil War time, oysters could filter 17 trillion gallons of water in the bay in 2 days. 2 days, 17 trillion gallons of water. That's what they figure the Chesapeake Bay holds, okay? Now, the remaining oysters that we got left to filter 17 trillion gallons takes 700 days, or what? Another almost a year and a half. Next slide. The oyster habitats have been destroyed, and with it, the health of the Chesapeake Bay, and has been seriously compromised. Okay, seriously compromised. I know we probably don't pay as much, many thousands of people pay attention to the bay and its health. But for most Virginians and Americans, you know, the Chesapeake Bay is just a cool place to go with a boat, you know. But the water is filtered by these guys. It's cleansed by them. And we destroyed their homes and consequently their lives. Next slide. Now, I didn't want to get too far down the rabbit hole here on all the different diseases. There are a few that we're going to mention. Basically, what happens is once you destroyed the substrate where oysters live on the rocks and the piers and underneath the water, you know, those big reefs, once you've destroyed those, then the oysters that we're trying to get to grow have only one place to go, and that's the mud at the bottom of the bay. And the mud has problems because it is a perfect habitat for diseases. So one of the issues that watermen and people that like oysters and the oystermen and all have to deal with are a series of diseases that here we go again, we created the environment for. Next slide. The combined impact of disease has caused hundreds of millions of dollars in losses over the 35 to 45 years, last 35, 45 years in mid-Atlantic states, and seriously threatens both natural and cultivated oyster populations. Again, there's the chart showing the decline. We have 1% left from what we used to have. That's like taking out 100 pennies and taking 1 penny out and saying all we got left is the 1 penny, right? But take a look at the Chesapeake Bay, that oyster population. Look where it was roughly today. And the goal for the Chesapeake Bay programs and the other multi-state initiatives that have been developed is to somehow reestablish this, not so much for like food, which is cool, but because it cleans the bay. Next slide. One of the most effective means to combat these diseases is the use of resistant strains of oysters produced in hatcheries and reared using aquacultural techniques. Now, we've got to be careful about this. There have been some experiments brought in where they brought in some species from Asia that were supposed to do really good in the bay. Bombed out, didn't take, okay? You just simply don't introduce a new species to an environment and say, everything's cool, it'll be great, don't worry. No, aquaculture, as you will soon see, is a really demanding farming technique. But it is possible. Here we go, next slide. Is it possible to restore the Chesapeake Bay oyster industry? Well, let's see, next slide. Aquaculture may be part of this long-term solution. Now, take a look at those pictures. That's kind of mind-blowing, okay? Did you know that the state of Virginia leases acreage of land underwater to watermen? I believe, I may be wrong. If I'm wrong, call in, okay, or whatever, at $1 an acre. $1 an acre. You can lease the bottom of a river or a tributary or something to, if you want to use one technique of aquaculture. There are a number of them. I'll show you as we go through here. So oyster habitats have been destroyed. What's left is artificial farming techniques. Next. The term aquaculture broadly refers to the cultivation of aquatic organisms in a controlled aquatic environment for any commercial, recreational, or public purpose. Okay, makes sense. Next slide. What are some of the methods of aqua farming that we, well, they are oyster cages, okay? That's, let's see, that's, okay. Suspended culture are those bags that are hanging on those lines. The surface floating is lower left. The oyster cages are those bottom picture there where the oyster's spilling out. They're the ones I've seen the most in this area when I've had an opportunity to visit watermen and oyster production sites in the bay. Suspended culture is the top picture on the right, and that's where the tides bring in. Remember I said the tides come in a couple of times a day, and they bring in the nutrients that the guys need to eat, so they'll filter out the food particles of the phytoplankton and live that way. But these are 4 methods that are used worldwide. It's not just in the Chesapeake Bay. Next slide. What are the pros and cons of aquaculture? Okay, since we destroyed the oysters' homes, tore them up, they're gone, and we know that that we have to use aquacultural techniques, because if we don't, there's no way that we can combat the diseases that are in the bay. And we're talking about not just here, but anywhere where oyster production is. A lot of oysters that we get here in this part of Virginia come from Louisiana, okay, or trucked in. But look at the size of that ring-like thing that guy is standing in front of. Next slide. All right, I had to shrink the font on this, so I'm going to read these. Here are the things that are good about aquaculture. Okay, the pros. Well, it helps the economy. Okay, helps feed people. Okay, helps to protect the coastline. All right, and the environment. Helps to protect species and habitats. Okay, is important for scientific research to develop as it's related to marine life. So basically, it's good for people. We like to eat them. It's good for the environment. So aquaculture has a lot of pros. But, next slide. What are the cons? Well, they are a threat of invasive species. So you just don't, I don't know, think that this doesn't come with a lot of risk. It does. Invasive species could be, I could go down. I'm going to be doing a program later on invasive species in the northern neck. And, lots of times people have good intentions, of bringing in, it's like those Asian oysters I mentioned. If you're going to do aquaculture, you have to filter. Either you're going to do it in a natural setting, or you're going to have to develop some sort of assistance, sort of, to filter the water. Contamination is a problem, okay? Especially from chemicals and pesticides. That's a big problem in the bay. Where do you think all the Scott's turf builder goes? Where do you think all that stuff goes into the bay, eventually through the water system? And that's why it's so important to manage what's going into the bay now. The fish waste, if you've ever had an aquarium, then you know about fish waste. Well, that's in a confined small area. Can you imagine tens of millions of things that are producing waste products? Proportion of wild fish, it says this has to do with the proportion of wild fish that are used to rear bigger fish in agro. So, yeah, you got to be careful about managing the size relationship of the animals that you're putting in cages or suspensions or what. And you got to monitor the growth constantly. It's hard work, guys. Oystering is hard work. Has a good payoff. It's hard work. Next slide. The bottom line, aquaculture allows us to feed the population without damaging the environment. That is an opportunity for an absolute win-win situation. And we should really seize that, okay? Because, and I like these pictures because they're from all over the world, okay? So aquaculture is not just done down in Monroe Bay here in the Northern Neck or someplace along the Rappahannock or the Potomac. It's big, huge business. And the payoffs are great, but you got to know what you're doing. Next slide. As of 2018, aquaculture continues to be the fastest growing food production method in the world, and now represents more than half the global human seafood consumption globally. We have 8 billion people now living on that blue marble, okay? And half of the seafood consumption is coming from aquaculture. Next slide. This brings us back to the bay. Okay, how old is the bay? You guys remember? 20,000 years, right? Drowned Susquehanna River. There it is. Next slide. Can the oyster industry recover from centuries of overharvesting, disease, and how about environmental neglect? I think we're seeing that now as we deal with global crisis of a changing global weather patterns. Next slide. As forests and wetlands have been replaced by farms and cities and suburbs to accommodate a growing population, nitrogen and phosphorus pollution to the Chesapeake Bay has greatly increased. Poor water quality has negatively affected important species, such as submerged bay grasses, blue crabs, oysters, fish. Hey, we ate up the oysters. We're slowly eating up all the blue crab. We know that fish species, from talking to watermen, are in danger. We really, as a species, us guys, really have to take care of, it's like biting the hand that feeds you. The bay is feeding us, and we keep biting it. Next slide. The future of the Chesapeake Bay and all the myriad life forms depend on how much we want to help preserve and protect. How much do we want to help preserve and protect the oyster and its environment? There are thousands of people, like these pictures represent, that are either developing programs of conservation and education. That's where it's all about, guys. We have to learn about the environment that we have taken for granted. Next slide. I figured I'd leave a little quote from Rachel Carson. Those who dwell among the beauties and mysteries of the earth are never alone or weary of life. Next slide. And that sort of closes it up for this week's Science Saturday. And it was meant to give you a little background on, well, obviously, oysters, right? And the bay and how interwoven they are. Okay, guys, check out the next one. Monsters of the Miocene oceans. Okay, I'm going to give you a little teaser here, okay? The oceans of the Miocene epoch, that was roughly 25 million to about 5 million years ago, which Stratford Hall has a wonderfully preserved record of the fossils of those animals that lived in the changing oceans that were during the Miocene epoch. Paleontologists and zoologists feel that the most dangerous oceans in the history of Earth were the Miocene oceans. And we're going to take a look at the cast of characters that it is not a Halloween program, but you can kind of push Halloween a little bit. Monsters of the Miocene, November 13th, 2021, same time, and there's and registration. And that's it. That's about it for today. If you have any questions or anything like that, I think Ann is going to handle those.
Yes, thank you, Jon. That was fascinating. Yes, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A down at the bottom, and Jon can answer. We'll stay on for a few more minutes, and if anybody has some questions, please drop them in, and we'll get them answered for you.
But it's again, ready? Old. Now.
It's fascinating. I know we were talking earlier, imagine how massive the amount of oyster meat that came out of that large.
Yeah, I was thinking, I didn't mention it during the program, but if I like oysters. Yeah, I like oysters. And when you open an oyster or have an oyster, they're not real big. They're maybe like, I don't know about that big, meaty, but one gulp, 170 million pounds, a million. It's just mind blowing. In fact, there are islands in the Chesapeake Bay that are basically shells, piles of shells, because they were used as dumping grounds during the 19th century and I guess half the 20th century, just dumping more shells on top of it. So
So, give it another minute or so to see if anybody has any questions.
Keep learning about the bay. It's the only one we got, guys.
Well, I think it looks like you probably answered everybody's questions during the program. So,
Well, they can always get in touch with me
Yeah,
at Stratford
yep.
Hall.
Anybody, please feel free to reach out to Jon Bachman. His information is on our website, and we so appreciate you tuning in today.
Yeah.
And we look forward to welcoming you to the next Science Saturday on November 13th.
Monsters of the
Monsters
Miocene.
of the Miocene. That's right. All right, thank you, everybody. And we will also be sharing this on our YouTube channel, as long as the other Science Saturday programs that Jon has hosted and the future ones that are coming will all eventually be on our YouTube channel. So please check them out there.
Well, thank you, Ann, for co-hosting the moment.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure to join you today.
It looks like you're about ready to turn around and walk down to the beach. You know?
I wish. I do wish. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Take care.